3 years ago today, the Taliban stormed into Kabul and retook control of Afghanistan, just days after the U.S. withdrew from its 20-year war. The group celebrated its return to power today on a former U.S. air base. The Taliban paraded its military hardware at what was once the largest U.S. and NATO military base in Afghanistan. Some of the equipment was owned by allied forces. There was no acknowledgement of the dire humanitarian conditions the country faces. More than half the population is in urgent need of assistance, and women face some of the world's worst rights abuses. Retired Major General Denis Thompson was a Task Force Kandahar commander from April 2008 to February 2009. He joins me now. Thanks for coming on, sir.
Thanks for having me, JP.
So I want to start by asking you about some of the images we're seeing out of Afghanistan. The Taliban are celebrating the anniversary of their return to power by parading around in abandoned U.S. equipment at the former Bagram American Air Base. The Taliban, they are showing off some of the high-powered stuff that was left behind, and they're quite defiant. What do you think about? What goes through your mind when you see those sort of images?
What I think about is the reaction of Canadian veterans who fought for so many years inside of Afghanistan for a different result. And what I'm often asked is, was it all worth it? And I continue to tell them that at the end of the day, a soldier's job is to create space, time and space, for politicians and policymakers to come up with a solution to whatever the conundrum is. In this case, we had decided we were going to do some nation building that clearly failed at the institutional level. So the thoughts that run through my mind basically are related to the reaction that our veterans had when Kabul fell after they had put so much blood, sweat, and tears into that country.
Yeah, let's talk about the fall of Kabul. We're now 3 years on, and conditions in the country have changed a lot. We're now seeing, of course, an extreme form of Sharia law in place. Women and girls are again marginalized. About 12 million people are in dire need of food. Taliban commanders that those veterans fought against are now firmly back in control. How are you feeling about the state of affairs in the country?
Well, it's hard to have feelings for the Taliban, to be sure. And again, it comes back to the fact that we had an effort to build a nation. We failed, and now we have to live with the consequences. And unfortunately, those consequences don't rest with us. They rest with the people of Afghanistan. And so while it's not particularly joyous to admit failure, that's exactly what we have here, is a failure to fix a nation, and perhaps it was a problem that was just too large to fix in the first place.
What's your message to fellow veterans who feel dejected about the state of affairs, who feel like what they fought for, might have been all for naught?
Well, exactly as I've already stated, the veterans have nothing to be ashamed of. Canada conducted itself, and Canadian soldiers conducted themselves in an exemplary fashion under very tough conditions, produced enough space, I believe, for policymakers and politicians to come up with a tenable solution at the national level, at the institutional level, but that never happened. And it's indicative of a lot of capacity building efforts around the world. If you think of Haiti today, the number of policemen that have been trained in Haiti is eye-watering, and yet that country completely collapsed again because the institutions that sit above those that are walking the beat, if you will, or in the case of the Afghan National Army, those soldiers who fought tenaciously beside us weren't supported by their own leadership. It's the exact opposite of what's happening in Ukraine, where Mr. Zelensky didn't want to ride out, he wanted ammunition. And we had Mr. Ashraf Ghani, who split the moment that the temperature turned up around Kandahar, and around Kabul.
Yeah. Speaking of institutions, you've long said Canada has a moral obligation to get Afghans who helped us out of that country and help resettle them here in Canada. So far, about 40,000 have been resettled in Canada. Are you satisfied with the government's response to this point? Do you think that they've done enough?
Let's be clear. Most of those 40,000 people who were resettled in Canada under the Special Immigration Measures Program were already out of Afghanistan. The NGO that I work with, Aman Laura as it's called, which means sheltered path in Pashto, has moved over 2,000 people, have evacuated 2,000 people from inside of Afghanistan, eligible Afghans, if you will, those that worked with Canada, whether they were interpreters or people who worked in the embassy, et cetera, as well as the others who also managed to get themselves out of the country and resettled them back in Canada. That number is closer to 3,000. So there are still people left behind in Afghanistan that this NGO, Aman Laura, is still working to get them out. Again, we do have some financial support from the government of Canada. It's not entirely a negative story. In fact, we've got funding until December of this year to move another 1,250 people out. But it's not over yet. The 40,000 people, again, it's worth reiterating, most of them were already out of Afghanistan.
As you may have seen, there was some controversy just a few weeks ago over then Defense Minister Harjit Sajjan's attempts to allegedly, help coordinate the rescue of sick Afghans during the fall of Kabul. He has said that they weren't given any special treatment. There was nothing untoward here, but some military sources that we've spoken to here at CBC have kind of questioned his involvement in that rescue effort. Do you have any lingering concerns about how that all went down?
After the government fell on the 15th of August, 2021, we were actively engaged in trying to move people onto the airfield, the Kabul International Airfield. And for the longest time, there were no Canadian representatives there because, of course, the Canadian embassy left Afghanistan, whereas the other Western embassies collapsed, if you will, or moved onto the airfield in order to be able to move their foreign nationals, their nationals out and their permanent residents out. So once the Canadian government eventually got stood up inside of the Kabul International Airport, they were able to process largely Canadian citizens and permanent residents, whilst we had hundreds of people outside of the airport clamoring to get in, and yet we could not get any support, if you will, outside of the airport for these very deserving Afghans. And I think that's what's the most frustrating about hearing that we were going to go after people who had no relationship with Canada while leaving those that had helped us during the dark days of the combat in Kandahar were left outside of the wire, if you will, and then had to struggle for months to get to Islamabad and eventually resettled back here in Canada.
As you know, there's been some UN-held talks with the Taliban, and it's not quite a peace summit, but they're trying to gather folks in Qatar and maybe come to some sort of agreement on integrating the Taliban-led Afghanistan into the international community again. What do you make of these efforts? Do you think it's appropriate to be negotiating with the Taliban?
It's one thing to negotiate with another party, just as the world is required to negotiate with Hamas to settle affairs in Gaza, we must negotiate with the Taliban in order to ameliorate the conditions of life inside of the country. That's negotiation. It is not recognition. So I am all for some form of negotiation to increase the quality of life of people inside of Afghanistan, even if it's only a marginal increase, in order to alleviate the misery that they're feeling. But I am not at all condoning the recognition of the Taliban as a legitimate government of Afghanistan.
Any final thoughts to Canadians as they are contemplating this 3-year anniversary of the fall of Kabul? Maybe mention again your efforts with refugees. What should Canadians take away from this anniversary?
Well, the refugee problem worldwide is enormous. Afghanistan is but one example. The program that's in place by the government will run out on the 31st of December of this year, and we are actively seeking other than government funding in order to continue our efforts there and other parts of the world where we're involved in evacuating people from dangerous situations. So for the broader Canadian public, look up amanlaura.com and you'll have an opportunity to participate or at least to assist this worthwhile NGO in its efforts to get people out of harm's way.
All right, let's leave it there. Thank you so much. Retired Major General Denis Thompson. Appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you, JP.